Sometimes it happens that small games from a little-known studios attract the attention of a wide audience. They get a solid coverage in the press and on a variety of specialized resources and forums, where they are discussed by users. If the project hits the number of the lucky ones, it has all changed to sell well and become at least a local hit. Its further success will depend solely on the quality of performance. In 2017, one of the lucky ones who managed to please the public was Biomutant. This open-world action game from Experience Studio and publisher THQ Nordic had an interesting post-apocalyptic setting, a deep combat system and interesting gameplay mechanics. At least this was the impression left after first experience with the project. Having seen the enthusiastic reception among the audience, the developers decided to make Biomutant a much more ambitious game than it was planned before, and that is where the problem arose. What they are and whatever is worth to join the fresh creation of Experiment 101, find out in our review. The game begins with a character editor where the user creates his own anthropomorphic animal. He can choose the race, hair color, set of parameters, and resistance to negative effects. Then the player appears in a small location, where he meets Lupus Lupin, the monster that kills the main character's parents. The clash with him ends in fight as the protagonist does not have enough strength to win. He hides in a bunker called Experiment 101 and find an old experience here that in fact sets global goals for the protagonist, to save the Tree of Life, whose roots are trying to destroy huge monster Miroids, and to put an end to the war between the tribes. To this whose task is add revenge for the lost family, and with his baggage the protagonist sets out to explore the open world. Notice how strange and ridiculous the plot feels? Don't be surprised in Biomutant. The entire plot is like this. One of its main problems is the lack of clear connection between several narrative lines. The protagonist is shown as the chosen one who must have the Tree of Life, and visit everything else. Starting quests in the project include joining a light or dark faction. The first wants to destroy the world, and the second to save it in the current form. The user must decide whose philosophy is closer to him and take the operative side. The ending of Biomutant depends on said choice. Why to support the evil beast? No one explains, and the goal to destroy the remains of the post-apocalyptic world looks silly in itself. The game tries to justify the decision somehow, but it turns out to be mostly ridiculous. The screenwriters did not bother to connect the tribal war and the murder of the worldlings. Because of this, there's a feeling as if the story was written in pieces, which were glued not even with white threads, but with a blue duct tape. Or for the sake of the word, this is the slogan of Biomutant. They plug up every plot hole, and there are so many of them in the narrative that it forms a real seal. Logical and cause and effect connection are lame on both legs, which accumulate a whole lump of conventions. At some point it becomes impossible to ignore them, and the only way out of this situation is to stop following the plot. The problems are exacerbated by the presentation of the narrative. The developer decided to save money on the dialogues and implement a voice-over narrator, who comments on the adventure and retells the gist of each adventures. Animals in Biomutant supposedly communicate in their own languages, and players do not have to understand them. The use of such a technique impairs immersion and prevents the characters from revealing themselves. None of the characters in the game can be called even a memorable personality with a character of their own. They all feel like functions that simply move the plot forward. And the final nail in the lid of the huge coffin labeled storytelling was the execution of the dialogues. They are written eerily absurd, and a third of the narrative's lines can even be removed because they make no sense. In addition, the game likes to proclaim prejudice with an important view, which even makes you feel uncomfortable. Among the few pulses of the plot is the hour system. Individual decisions and lines have a light or dark coloring. Accordingly, the main character can be made good or evil, and access to individual active skills depend on this. The story also sometimes raises interesting themselves, such as the pollution of the earth and the importance of caring for the environment. However, the few adventures of the story are completely deleted by its disadvantages. Biomutant's open-world experience is not as dismal as the story. The developers from Experience 101 equipped it with a colorful post-apocalyptic environment, several biomes, and a lot of location. In most locations you can find equipment, small wall-switching puzzles, and a pack of enemies with a mini-boss at the head. Initially, no activity is displayed on the map, but after 15 hours of passing it will be dotted with icons. It's just a pity that most of them are tasks of the format find a certain number of objects of a certain type. Full-fledged edition quests in the game occurs less frequently, but they sometimes delight with a good execution. Interesting is exploring the world of the Biomutant is supported by the developers in several ways. The first of these is clearly configured collection. Upon visiting each location, the player is told how many valuable items of a particular type are kept here, but where exactly they are, you will have to find out for yourself. This strengthens the anticipation before receiving the loot and the desire to truthfully inspect everything. The second way is to able to move around the world in different modes of transport. If you change them often and don't forget to improve them, travel will be much less boring. And the third reason for maintaining interest, the element of Metroidvania. Sometimes in order to get to a particular location, you must first find the right equipment. When the player acquires the necessary equipment and finds values in a previously inaccessible area, then the player will feel double joy from the loot and a little experience adventure. Exploring the world, collecting equipment, and completing minor quests are only a small part of a gameplay. It's based on battles, which unfortunately also implemented controversially. In the editor, the player chooses the class of the character, but it is in fact a convention. If you take a ranger fighter, there is nothing to stop you from changing your specialization. For example, to arm yourself with two one-handed swords. The leveling system in the game is quite flexible and consists of many elements, which increase the level of the user, increase the characteristic of the protagonist, and for the special point get passive bonuses and combination of punches for a particular type of weapon. Close combat and range. They are performed by pressing a few keys, so it's easy to remember. After using 3 different special combinations, you will be able to enter Wang Fu mode. It allows you to make a particularly powerful attacks and significantly increase the damage, but effect lasts only a few seconds. While exploring the world and making important decisions, the player will accumulate biogens and psychologies. They are spent to acquire active skills, fire jerk, mushroom that throws enemies into the air, poisonous paddle, strong impact on the ground, and so on. Separately, it is important to note that the player can take turns in melee and range combat. Different keys are responsible for shooting and attacking with a cold weapon, and it's not difficult to shorten or break the distance in a Biomutant. It's enough to do a few somersaults or use the double jump, but the first problem of the combat system is related to parrying. Many enemies have turn animation of blows, which makes it difficult to catch the timing. The second obvious flaw is the horribly implemented hitboxes. Sometimes enemies deal damage even after a perfect dodge, which is accompanied by a time delay. And one boss in the project drove stones, which fly along an unmanageable trajectory and have incredibly crude models. In addition, Biomutant is extremely poor at conveying the feel of the impacts and shots. The sound is mediocrely tuned, and the gravity of the weapon can be felt. The protagonist looks like it's stabbing his enemies with toothpicks, and this analogy is already inevitable in the first half of the game. The situation is slightly saved by the comic effect, but again, not every player will like them. In general, the battles in Biomutant leave contrary impressions. The aforementioned problems constantly remind us of themselves, but they are partly compensated by a high dynamic of fights and the abundance of character builds. In addition, there is an interesting system of equipment crafting implemented in the project. Protective items for which 7 cells are set aside. You can install dodger, and weapons are created from several components, which increase different parameters: damage, penetration, change of critical damage, and etc. Graphics in Biomutant, to put it mildly, is not impressive. Even if you look with a half-closed eyes, you can see bare angular models and mediocre lightings, and when you begin to explore the world in detail, this are dozens of problems. There is particular absence of shadows and crooked animation and geometry errors and much more. The music in the game comes off only in background music. The melodies are absolutely unrecognizable. Developers, to sum up this, developers Biomutant clearly chased after skill after the first show of the game. They themselves confirm this in numerous interviews, true not directly. An attempt to make a great project with an open world did not end very well. Biomutant has overgrown gaming systems, but they feel either redundant or not deep enough. The project became a victim of excessive audience attention and ambition of Experiment 101, a studio with 20 developers on board. Its debut cannot be called a complete failure. The game can be enjoyable to a certain extent. However, it has many more problems than expected.